Hi everybody, been a long time since I made a video, yes I realize, but I'm back now, and I've been doing a lot of reading on the topic of abortion, and I figure, well, who better to make a video response to about this subject than Sisyphus Redeemed, since he's made quite a few videos on this topic here, and I must confess, I feel a little bit intimidated going up against him. I know he's a professional philosopher, but alas, I will do my best here. Now, the video I'm responding to is a video he did about the violinist argument. Now, just a quick recap for those of you who don't know, the violinist argument is basically an argument developed by Judith Jarvis Thompson where she grants that the fetus is a person, just like pro-lifers argue, and then spins the thought experiment of suppose you've been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers and your kidneys are hooked up to this unconscious violinist, and you're the only person with the right blood type, and he's going to die unless you stay hooked up to him. Now, should you be forced against your will to stay hooked up to the violinist? Well, the answer seems to be no, and thus that you have a right to unhook yourself from him. And just as you have the right to unhook yourself from the violinist, a pregnant woman has the right to unhook herself, so to speak, from her child here. Now, there are numerous objections to this argument here, but in this video, and because Sisyphus Redeemed did reply to this objection somewhat, my focus will be to defend what's called the responsibility objection. Namely, basically the responsibility objection is this. It's the idea that because the woman voluntarily engaged in an act that creates needy children, sex, she's therefore responsible for creating a needy child, and thus has a responsibility to care for it, i.e. not kill it. Now, to better help demonstrate this idea, let's use what I like to call the reverse violinist thought experiment taken from Trent Horn. So you wake up in a hospital bed, surgically connected to an unconscious man. So you disconnect yourself from him, and then suddenly you start to pass out, and you feel nauseated and everything. And then the hospital director comes in and says, "No, you got to hook yourself up to him, or you're going to die." So you hook yourself back up to him, and then the hospital director explains to you that, yeah, look, the Society of Musical Pranksters apparently kidnapped you, and they gave you this kidney condition now, and so you have to stay hooked up to this guy who did this to you, who's part of the society. Otherwise, you're going to die here. Now, of course, you're just like, well, this is insane here. But then suppose the man next to you, the guy part of the society who gave you this condition, who's hooked up to you, suddenly wakes up and looks at you and says, well, since you don't have the right to use my body against my will here, it's not required for me to stay connected to you, so I'm just going to disconnect myself here and go about my day. And he disconnects from you, and you die. Well, clearly, what's wrong with this? We all want to say that that was wrong. Why? Well, because this guy, he put you in that situation. I mean, he did this to you, and likewise, it's the same with the mother and the father, since they engaged in an act that creates needy children, in this case, a fetus here. Before we go on, let's look at Sisyphus Redeemed's reply to this objection here.
Simply because a woman chooses willfully and freely to have sex, it does not follow that she is consented to allow another person to use her body against her will. And if you don't believe that, let's go back and quickly just change the original objection, the original thought experiment. Let's say that instead of just minding your own business when you're kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers, let's say that you go to the opera, and you've read news reports that say, well, people at this opera recently have been kidnapped and hooked up to famous musicians who have had kidney ailments. So there's a possibility that if you go to this opera, you might end up getting hooked up. You choose to go anyway, and sure enough, you're kidnapped and hooked up. So you're not really completely innocent. It's not the case that you had no responsibilities. You were aware of the future possibility that you might be caught and hooked up. Are you now obliged to stay hooked up to the violinist? I don't think so. Another person is using your body against your will. The fact that you could have done something to prevent it, or that you did something that in some way was part of a causal chain that led you to being put in that position, is irrelevant. All that matters is that never, at any point, did you give consent to allow another person to use their body.
Now, it seems wrong to me to suggest that in the case of pregnancy, the woman was merely part of a causal chain. Rather, it seems better to say that she and the father were directly responsible for the child, given that pregnancy is the intelligible end of sex and is what happens when our reproductive organs are functioning properly. I mean, what else is a uterus for? The thing is, kidneys are not meant, so to speak, to be hooked up to someone else, but a uterus is clearly meant to sustain a fetus. While it is true, of course, that reproduction is not the only function of sex, that hardly gives grounds for saying that sex isn't ordered towards pregnancy, even if people don't have sex for the reason or intent of getting pregnant. But to put it differently, let me ask this question. Let me ask this. I mean, if I walk up to a baby-making machine, which, let's say, also happens to give me an orgasm when I use it, and I press the start button, am I really not responsible for what comes out of it? It seems to me, however, that SR's modified example of the violinist story only works because going into a theater where you could potentially get kidnapped is not intrinsically ordered toward being hooked up to a violinist, whereas sex, I think, is clearly ordered toward pregnancy. And this idea, I maintain, is at least as intuitive an idea as Thompson's violinist story. But moreover, if consent to sex really doesn't entail consent to pregnancy, as proponents of this argument would like us to believe, then I maintain that if we follow this line of thought consistently, we would be led to a conclusion that most pro-choicers would not accept, namely that the father has no responsibility. I mean, suppose we have a case where a woman, despite using protection, ends up pregnant, and suppose she then decides to give birth and raise the child, and then suppose further that the father leaves her, and then the woman decides to sue the father to make him pay child support. Now, following Thompson's logic of consent, suppose the father said, look, I consented to sex, but I never consented to be a father. I didn't intend to be a father, and so I have no responsibility to this child, and you have no right to force me to pay child support, since I have no responsibility to this child. And that seems crazy. And of course, you know, a pro-choicer could always just bite the bullet, like David Boonin does, and say that the father doesn't have a responsibility to the child. And if one is willing to do that, then I suppose this point will have little force. But I suspect most people would find that conclusion unacceptable. Now, just to drive this point about consent home even further, suppose a surrogate mother who's consented to get pregnant and give birth to the child, but suppose she's in a secluded cabin and then a snowstorm comes in and she's snowed in by herself, and then suppose she gives birth to the child, but suppose she says that, well, you know, she there's no baby supplies and she can only breastfeed the child, and she says, well, you know, I never consented to raise the child here, and because it's my body, my choice, I have no right to sustain this child here with my body, and so she lets the child starve to death. Well, clearly there's something obviously wrong with this situation here. So, now, of course, one could still ask at this point if Thompson's argument works in the case of rape, since the responsibility objection does presuppose that the act of sex was voluntary. But, of course, here I would simply appeal to a different principle, namely the duty to rescue. Thompson's argument seems to presuppose a view of moral duty that I think most of us would find prima facie mistaken, at least, namely moral voluntarism, the idea that we have no moral duties to someone unless we have assumed it. But I think that we can show this idea to be very counterintuitive once we think about it. I mean, to take an example from Francis Beckwith, suppose we have a hermit woman, you know, living in a secluded place up in northern Alaska. You know, she's like, say, in her mid-60s or something. You know, she's just trying to get away from the stressful lifestyle because she gets stressed easily and has mental problems. Now, suppose a baby is left on her doorstep here, and there's no way she can call social services, or at least for the next few months until the winter's over. And she has plenty of supplies for her and the baby. Now, and of course, taking care of the child, you know, suppose it will likely result in lots of mental and physical stress on her, given her age and her non-likeness for stress. Now, suppose, you know, following the logic of people like Thompson, she says, well, I did not consent to have this child on my doorstep, and since caring for this child is too much of a physical and mental burden on my part, thus I will leave the child outside to either freeze or starve to death. Yes, it may die, but, you know, I have no responsibility to this child unless I have explicitly assumed it here. Yet I think many of us would find this deeply wrong here. And so, I maintain that even in the case of rape, the violinist argument doesn't work. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video here. And also Migkillertwo and Knownomore, I think both have both made great video responses to this argument. Links in the description section below, as well as a few other articles one might be interested in that are critical of the violinist argument. So, yeah, everybody, take care.